If we don't know who wrote the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then we can't really know how qualified the authors were to report on the life and ministry of Jesus. So, did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really author the Gospels bearing their names? Last year at the Sound Faith Conference 2025, two top scholars of the New Testament debated the authors of the Gospels, Licona and Bart Ehrman. Licona argued that evidence is in favor of the traditional authorship for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whereas Ehrman argued that these men did not write the Gospels and we don't know who did. If you haven't seen it, it's worth a watch. Licona has it hosted on his channel, link in the comments. In this video, I'm going to summarize both sides real quick and spend most of our time bringing clarity to what happened in their exchanges and also why. Because there were a few moments where it felt like the debaters got a little stuck, and that's often a confusing experience for the audience. What I have prepared, I think, will really help bring clarity to the issue. In favor of the traditional authors, Mike Licona opened the debate by presenting what he called two buckets of evidence, external and internal. That is, evidence found outside the four Gospels and evidence found inside by reading the four Gospels. He started with external evidence and identified 6 sources in the 2nd century that at least hint at or confirm at least one or more of the traditional authors for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The fragments of Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Theophilus, the Muratorian fragment, and Clement of Alexandria. He pointed out that all agree and are spread across geographically diverse regions. As for internal evidence, he says, we're looking for clues in the Gospels that are consistent with the external claims of authorship. For example, the person Mark worked alongside Peter. The Gospel of Mark contains a lot of material about Peter. That fits. The person Luke traveled with Paul. Using evidence from passages of Acts, we learn that the author of the Gospel of Luke traveled with Paul. That fits. The person John was one of the 3 closest disciples of Jesus. The Gospel of John gives us close insider front row access to the life of Jesus. That fits. Matthew was a tax collector. He worked with money. The author of the Gospel of Matthew says a lot about taxes and types of coins. That fits. So, to summarize, the external evidence for the traditional authors of the Gospels is testimony reports, and the internal evidence for the traditional authors of the Gospels is arguments from fittingness. Then, Bart Ehrman steps to the plate. And again, he holds that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write the books bearing their names. And, well, let me just acknowledge real quick my respect for him, a skeptic, to debate an apologist at an apologetics conference. That takes guts. And he held his position about as well as anyone could. Anyway, Ehrman's arguments could also be categorized as external and internal. He didn't say it that way, but for the sake of clarity and balance, I'll categorize his stuff in those buckets as well. As far as internal evidence goes, Ehrman points out that the Gospels themselves are anonymous. They don't tell us who wrote them. Matthew 9:9 mentions the tax collector Matthew in the 3rd person, so it sounds like someone writing about Matthew rather than Matthew writing about himself. According to the Gospels, the disciples were uneducated, Aramaic-speaking day laborers from rural Galilee, but the Gospels appear to have come from Greek-speaking, highly educated, trained authors from Greek-speaking realms. This gets into the external evidence. Ehrman discusses rural life, wealth distribution, and educational systems. He says the vast majority of Jews at that time could not write. If they could, it wasn't Greek. If they could write Greek, well, then they could not compose good Greek. He concludes from this information that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would be incapable of authoring the 4 books bearing their names. So they did not write the Gospels, and we don't know who did. So who's right? I mean, if you've followed my channel for a while, it wouldn't surprise you where I stand on this. I did a video arguing for the traditional authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in my series on the historical reliability of the Gospels. Watching this debate, I learned a ton, and I have a better appreciation for Ehrman's side, but I still side with Licona. And a lot could be said. I just want to highlight what really sticks out to me. In my own videos on the authorship of the biblical books, I often stress the importance of early church testimony. Licona and Ehrman debated this quite a bit, but both agree that we have a unanimous view on the authorship 100 years after the books were written. That, to me, seems really good. To Ehrman, it seems really bad. Why? I don't really know. I mean, 100 years is not within one lifetime, sure, but it is within two. Irenaeus, who gives us the four Gospels, or the four authors of the Gospels, personally knew Polycarp, who knew John. If my grandpa tells me that his father served in World War I, would you blame me for believing that? So I think Licona's external evidence is good, and despite Ehrman stressing that it's really only one source that's spread out to everyone else, Licona stressed that these sources are spread across geographically diverse regions, so it's hard to say that it just started from one place. Licona also offered internal evidence that Ehrman didn't find compelling. In his second rebuttal, Ehrman says this:
"The internal evidence that Mike cites, you should pay very careful attention to. He says, for example, that in the Gospel of Mark, Peter is center stage, therefore it's Peter's voice. The Gospel of John seems to have a lot of intimate detail, therefore it's by the beloved disciple John." One thing to point out about that is that if you have a narrative that gives detailed description about a particular person, that does not mean that the person is the author.
Admittedly, I got a little frustrated here because I did pay careful attention to Mike, and that's not what he says. Mike Licona isn't using therefore as if this is a deductive argument. He's not using deduction at all with his internal evidence. He's using arguments of fittingness. Arguments of fittingness only work to support other theories or evidences that are already in place, and that's how Licona uses them. He even stresses that, pointing it out several times. That's why Licona started with the external evidence, because testimony and reportage stand on their own. Fittingness arguments do not stand on their own, but they can support testimony and reportage. In Licona's own phrasing, it's consistent with external evidence. He even gave a whole illustration in his opening statement about how this works with a guy who is said to be a realtor, and then you hear him talking with all this real estate terminology. You would reasonably conclude that his use of terms supports the notion that he is a real estate agent, even though it doesn't establish the notion that he's a real estate agent. That was established earlier when we were informed that he was a realtor. Earlier, Ehrman points out that Paul doesn't mention tense very often, despite it being written by Paul, and that Revelation has a lot to say about money, despite it not being written by Matthew. Here, Ehrman is trying to undo Licona's internal evidence by showing that the inverse isn't true. But arguments from fittingness don't work inversely. If I'm told that someone across the way is a realtor, and I have a conversation where they don't use real estate terms, that's not evidence they aren't real estate agents. It's just a lack of further evidence that they are. But if they do use real estate terms, that's further evidence they are. It works because I have already been told about the guy's job, and his use of real estate terms fits. Just like Matthew and the coins, just like Mark emphasizing Peter, just like Luke as Paul's travel companion, just like John with insider language. Now, the big issue here, and you saw this if you watched the debate, is whether the authors of the Gospels could have used other people to help them write their stories. This is so important, and a lot of Ehrman's position hangs on this. I really think we need to understand what happened here. So Please be patient as I unpack this. We will return, I promise. In the debate as a whole, both Licona and Ehrman used some speculation to deal with each other's arguments. Licona said, well, the authors of the Gospels could have used other people to write for them. Likewise, Ehrman said, well, the reason early writers like Irenaeus say it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that they were fighting heresy and needed to attach an authoritative name to those writings. And as counter responses, both Ehrman and Licona kind of poked at each other for giving speculation rather than evidence. Ehrman said there's no evidence that the authors of the Gospels used other people to write for them, or that such a practice even existed. Likewise, Licona says there's no evidence that people made up the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to counter heresy. Here's what you need to understand. Just because a rebuttal doesn't have evidence doesn't mean it isn't rational or warranted. Let me give an illustration because that might sound a little odd. I step outside and I see that it's raining. That's evidence for rain. I go back inside and my friend says it's not raining because his phone's weather app says it's sunny right now. That's evidence against rain. So which is it? Well, I take my sight of the rain to be stronger evidence than the evidence of my friend's phone. But the question still remains, why does my friend's phone say it's not raining? So I speculate. Maybe his phone is glitching. I don't have evidence for this, but my speculation is warranted because I have very strong evidence for my position that it is raining. Namely, I saw it rain. And that gives me allowance to speculate why my friend's phone says otherwise. Obviously, not all speculation is equal. If I speculate that there's like little green men inside my friend's phone messing with his display, that's one thing. But if I speculate a more believable story, like a glitchy phone, that's more believable. So if you have evidence for your side and you think it's stronger than the evidence against your side, you don't need evidence in your rebuttals of the opposing view. It helps, but you don't need it. You just need to show that the opposing conclusion could somehow be wrong, and the more believable your rebuttals are, the stronger your overall case is. So, returning to Licona and Ehrman, if Licona has better evidence than Ehrman, which I think he does, then Licona is perfectly rational to speculate some way in which Ehrman's evidence doesn't work. So let's walk through this. Ehrman put a lot of stock in his position that the traditional authors could not have written the four Gospels bearing their names. In response, Licona said they could have used help. Ehrman thinks you need evidence to support that claim, so he says he searched everywhere and couldn't find evidence that people used other people to help write historical narratives. Ehrman challenged Licona to provide one piece of evidence that it ever happened. To be fair, Licona did provide some evidence, but it wasn't close enough, in Ehrman's view, to count as proper evidence. But setting all of that aside, let's ask the more important question: do we have good reason to believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John used help? That's not the same as asking if there's evidence, because not every reasonable belief is evidence-based. Almost any epistemologist will tell you that. So it's a broader question, and I think Licona did a good job addressing it. Take a look at 52 and a half minutes into this debate.
Now, folks, it doesn't take much imagination at all to see what probably happened. Think about the disciples. They had walked with Jesus. They were teaching that Jesus was the Son of God. He offered salvation, forgiveness of sins, eternal life. People were believing them on this. And as the disciples were growing old and dying, how plausible do you think it is that people would have come to them and said, look, don't take this stuff to the grave. We need your stories in writing. Can't read or write here. Well, we'll help you. Plenty of people, literacy was low, but there's still plenty of people around that would have been glad to help them who were literate. And they would have said, look, I'd be honored to help you get this stuff in writing. And on top of that, there were plenty. I could list 11 people I know at minimum in the New Testament who had the means and would have gladly funded such a project.
Given Licona's evidence that the authors were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and given the evidence that at least some of them were illiterate, Licona's explanation makes a lot of sense and it fits really well. For that reason, we have reasonable grounds to believing that they used other people to help write for them, and I don't think Ehrman or anyone else needs to demand further evidence at that point. Now, Ehrman is also free to speculate why Licona's evidence is wrong. Licona points out evidence of people in 100 years saying it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Ehrman said the reason is that the church needed authoritative voices to counter heresy. I don't blame Ehrman for thinking that way, given his confidence against the four traditional authors. We know heresy was a problem back then, so that fits. But even still, I find his thoughts to be less convincing than the idea that the authors had help writing. Let's play out a story, okay? We're living in the 2nd century. We have these 4 books. We want to use them to fight heresy as Christians. We need to give them credibility. So we come up with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Great, okay? We have 2 disciples and 2 followers of the most important apostles. As Ehrman says, yeah, but if the early church was just making it up to fight heresy, they could have done even better. They could have done Peter rather than a follower of Peter. And although Paul was a great apostle, he didn't spend time with Jesus in the same kind of way like the original 12. John is a great name if you wanted to make it up, so I'll grant you that. But Matthew, he was a tax collector. Jews hated those people. My goodness. If you're remaking this and picking your own authors, and pick any disciple other than Matthew. I watched the full debate. There was a lot more to it. I saw some weaknesses in Licona's arguments that I think Ehrman was right to push against. Overall, however, I think both Licona and Ehrman did a good job presenting their evidence, but I would say that Licona's position came out on top because Licona's ability to deal with Ehrman's evidence outperformed Ehrman's ability to deal with Licona's evidence. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to view the whole debate yourself. Give some love to Licona's channel where the debate is hosted. Again, link in the comments. Let me offer one final takeaway. It's certainly possible to be a Christian and not hold to the traditional authorship of the Gospels. The inspiration and authority of the Gospels don't depend on the person who wrote them. But part of my reason for doing this video was actually to help us see something going on with Bart Ehrman, because often Ehrman does speak against really foundational and important aspects of the Christian faith. And a lot of faithful Christians, seeing Ehrman doing his thing, they get really nervous. They know he's an expert on the New Testament. They know he is super smart, and he is. Don't ever let people tell you otherwise. But it's not just knowing the information. It's knowing how to handle it well. That moves out of Ehrman's specialty as a New Testament scholar and into the realm of philosophy. I'm not saying he's a terrible philosopher. It's just not his specialty, and that's okay. So Christians don't need to panic because a really smart New Testament scholar says Christianity is false. There's just more to the conversation than being a walking encyclopedia of the first century Jewish and Roman world. We can respect Ehrman as a scholar without coming to the same conclusions he does about the information he puts on the table. If you'd like, I have a whole playlist of other videos where I discuss the authorship of pretty much all the other books of the Bible that are in question. The books of Moses, Ephesians, the pastoral epistles. Check it out. I'll put the link in the comments as well. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.